Hi everyone, well thanks for joining us. I'm Lianna Brinded, I'm Europe News Editor at Quartz, and with me is Dhruv Ghulati, and he's CEO and founder of Factmata, and then we've got Mevan Babakar, who's the head of automated fact-checking at Full Fact. So from that very poignant speech that we just heard about there, I mean, fake news permeates every single one of our lives, and so in the essence of how that will be tackled, it's not just about the ethics of it, it's what are the tangible ways in which that can be done. And so just to set the stage in terms of the fake news that you guys look at on a day-to-day basis, what does that look like? It's not as easy as to say there's a statistic that is false or there's a picture is false. There's a lot of nuance behind it as well. So it would be great to kick off with discussing what that fake news looks like and how it, permeates our society. Sure. Okay.
I can start, yeah. So the fake news that we kind of think about has a very, very wide spectrum. So, for example, some kind of fake news is basically trying to be humorous or funny or satirical, and it's just trying to basically create something that is completely made up to, perhaps generate some shares and generate some clicks, or sort of, again, try to create sort of some disruption in media. Another example is something which is completely made up to perhaps attack someone. So this relates to kind of hoaxes that sometimes attack celebrities, attack individual people, attack politicians. And the other type of stuff that we look at is a lot more subtle than that goes into effectively how real news, in a way, or stuff that may be debatable, is framed in a way that makes it seem like it actually happened when it actually didn't, or there's insubstantial evidence to actually prove that it happened. And there's lots of different types, but.
Yeah, so the way that I think about it is that fake news isn't a very helpful term. It actually means a lot of different things, and you started to get at that. There are lots of different types, and like you mentioned, satire is one of them. You can have false context, you can have things that are totally out and out false, or you can have things that are just misinterpreted, or things that are badly written, or things that have a headline that doesn't match the body of the article. Or something that actually somebody has just misinterpreted the numbers for. There's a miscalculation. So that is a very huge spectrum to be working in. It's something that someone accidentally got wrong to something that is out and out false. So it doesn't help to categorize them all as fake news. So the way that we like to think about it, and actually I've tweeted out some graphs, as a fact checker does, that tell you about the different types. And on top of the types, you should think about the different motivations that people have for putting stuff like this out into the world. So it might be for profit, it might be for propaganda, it might be poor journalism. And that's like another way of breaking it down that's actually quite complex. And finally, on top of types and motivations, we think about the distribution mechanisms as well. Is it a botnet? Is it your aunt sharing it accidentally because she believes it's true? Those are two very different things. And so once you have a combination of the type, the motivation, and the distribution mechanism, you can begin to start thinking about a tech solution to these things. Otherwise, just stay away.
So I think it'd be really worth highlighting actually how these different types of fake news can actually have an impact, not just on an individual level, but on a corporate level as well as a social level. So from what, in projects that you've both worked on, it would be good to get those tangible examples as well. We obviously know about questionably things to do with Brexit. We know stuff coming out from the US government. There's various ways that can be deemed as fake news, but it would be good to boil down on, again, the individual, corporate and social level of what impact those can have for the worse, obviously.
Okay, so we think about the different kinds of harms, and I'll talk about it like kind of abstractly and then go to specific examples, if that's helpful. But the harms could exist anywhere from an abuse of power to a misperception on a particular topic, or the shift in long-term attitudes. One is potentially immigration. If people get told specific things on immigration every single day, then it might change how they believe about that topic over time. A really great example during the Brexit campaign, Brexit referendum, was if you ask people out of 100 how, okay, I'm going to say this wrong, and because I work at a fact-checking charity, I'm not going to say it. But if you come back to me and I remember the story, I'll tell you. But let's leave that for now. You can also have election interference, disengagement and distrust, and at the other end of the spectrum, you can have radicalization. So if it's someone's wrong on the internet and radicalization, those are all very different harms that exist in the world. I'll think of the examples, come back to me.
Yeah, I actually picked out some cool examples that I thought were quite interesting. So there is something called the Great Moon Hoax on Wikipedia, so you can go and check it out. It was in 1835. Basically, a journalist in The Sun, a New York newspaper, basically said, "We've discovered life on Mars." So if you go on the Wikipedia page, you can actually see images of this, that supposedly this actually happened. And there are pictures of unicorns, there's pictures of goblins appearing on Mars. And again, this was retracted, 5-6 times. Some recent stories that have come out. So Anthony Bourdain was killed by a Clinton operative. So this is kind of, stories which are clearly trying to target an individual or try to spread a certain rumor. Another example that we've seen a lot is actually hyperpartisan news sources that basically try to push a right-wing or left-wing agenda. So one example was essentially a Muslim mayor in Minnesota supposedly canceling the 4th of July parade, which never happened. So, and then the final one I think is super interesting is when you look at bot-generated content, particularly with kind of the Internet Research Agency in Russia, or Azerbaijan has their own, you actually see continuous trolling or continuous sort of message spreading, retweeting of a certain message, trying to spread a sort of a wave of fever around a certain topic that something might be going on in a certain election, or that this person is doing something, has this certain viewpoint, when actually they don't.
So when it comes to actually trying to, from your guys' point of view, because you both obviously target how to cut through all that noise and get the facts behind it. I mean, with the speed and scale in which fake news can be generated now, we talked about bots, we've talked about social media. Yeah. It's just a waterfall every day of different ways to do it. So what kind of ways does AI work in cutting through that? Because we have talked about how there will be some that may seem glaringly obvious to people, but sometimes when it does come to maybe those hyperpartisan movements, it's not necessarily as black and white saying that something's right or wrong. How does AI, which is essentially a machine, is able to see what is more a nuanced way of fake news? How does that work?
So there are very simple sentences. Well, I think the first thing actually is to say that historically we've overreacted when we've introduced new technologies, and we tend to clamp down on them like the printing press. And actually well-intentioned solutions in this space have potentially very negative consequences. So we have to reject the responses that basically undermine free speech or undermine freedom of the press. And we have to be incredibly careful about that. But if we're going to introduce a solution that actually can help fact-checking scale or can help start to get at that problem space, if we're very specific about what it is that we're trying to target and what harm exactly we're trying to help reduce, then that's like a better place to start. But I guess it went to Baroness O'Neill's previous point about we have to respect the constraints that we work in. The way that we introduce AI and machine learning at full fact and automation at full fact is by looking at the way that fact checkers already fact check. So it's very much about looking at the types of claims that are good candidates for automatic checking. So really simple things like GDP is rising is a sentence that you could fairly easily parse out and understand that it's talking about GDP. You can start to get at the context that it's being said in, what geography it's being said in. And because we've been working very closely with the Office of National Statistics on their API, we can now in real time go to the ONS API, get the GDP numbers back in real time, and present that to a fact checker or a journalist when they need it most. So imagine if a journalist is at a press conference and someone has just said something about a national statistic, instead of going back to your office, doing the research, and then emailing them a question, pushing back in real time is something that we're trying to cut down on the time it takes to respond in a really profound way. So that's part of the work that we're doing. On top of that, we're also trying to find, of the things that we've already checked, as a fact-checking charity that's been going since 2010, or we've been checking things for an awfully long time, and it's not enough to just check something once. You want to spot every single time somebody repeats it. That's really where the value is. So we've built a system that allows us to understand the similarity of different claims, so we can go one step further and actually find a match, but also then get a correction, take it out of circulation, actually do something about it that means that the level of information quality is much higher.
Yeah, I mean, so it's the way that we look at it. If you look at those examples that I was going through, the percentage of content that can accurately, you can say, okay, that's definitely an incorrect sentence, right? There's a database that you rely on and you think that that's definitely correct, and that is an assumption you have to make. That's a small proportion of this problem. So the way that we think about misinformation in general, like if you think about, let's say, a hoax, or you think about a piece of satire, or you think about a piece of content being potentially biased, the way that we think about it is actually being able to probabilistically, not binary like this is right or wrong, but probabilistically give you some indicators that tell you that that piece of content might be something that you might want to double check. Because if you look at the actual cases where, again, you can actually say that's right or wrong, it's very, very small. The way that we want to build a system is we actually go into this, we build an internet where people essentially are educated, like feel the need to look at some information and double check it and enjoy that process of critical thinking, gathering evidence themselves, rather than relying on, someone else to kind of give them that judgment.
It's a really good point, and actually that's pretty much what I believe fact-checking is giving people information in real time to have the best available data so they can make a judgment for themselves. It's not about saying, like, here is our take on this issue, it's true or false. Like, we don't do ratings at all, actually, because, like you said earlier, it's all shades of grey, it's not black and white. And a really good example of that is Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn will get up at Prime Minister's questions, and one of them will say poverty is increasing, and one of them will say poverty is actually decreasing, and they'll just say that back and forth for a bit. But the reality of the situation is they're both right. There are two measures of poverty in the country. One is going up, one is going down, absolute poverty and relative poverty. And there's this idea that you can pick the statistics that best help your narrative, and that is becoming more and more of a part of our political world. And we're missing out all of this context that is actually very valuable if somebody needs to make a reasoned judgment about the landscape. And our work is very much about trying to add those shades of grey back in, which is very boring, but it's very important.
Yeah, I think it's also really, if you think about how the big social media platforms are trying to tackle this problem, essentially it's a two-pronged approach where you have an algorithm that highlights things that might be things that should be flagged, which is what I was describing in terms of probabilistic. Here are some indicators and signals that you should send this to. But at the end of it, there has to be sort of a human at the end of the chain. And I think the challenge in this process is how do you think about which humans get in the chain? How do you think about noise in their own checking? How do you think about the scalability, like you said? I think there's a couple of points on that. Doing the final check, but also help using human analytic skills, the things that we all have the ability to do, and actually embedding that within a system that can get better over time. And that's the whole notion of kind of active online learning, which is really, really difficult, but super interesting as a problem.
So I suppose that comes on to kind of the last part of it, of how we envisage this being rolled out across not just social media platforms, but to publishers and places like that. Where does it come into also the balance between using AI and machine learning, but also the human interaction in it? Because AI is not going to be the panacea to solve all our ills that we have in fake news, because people are going to be people, right? So where do you see like I suppose the tangible start-off ways that people can implement AI into their fact-checking, and how does that look like with the relationship in terms of the human interaction with that?
Yeah, so from our perspective, what I found really interesting actually starting off on this problem was it's people don't fully realize that fake news, this phenomenon that we're seeing right now, is really driven, or the same technologies came from for commercial means. So if you look at the Internet Research Agency in Russia, they actually started off as a social media influencer company. And they literally just hired them in to start doing political campaigns. We all know about Cambridge Analytica. Turns out Cambridge Analytica has a whole ads business as well. So there's entire industries that are based upon essentially giving you a piece of information, like here's an ad for a washing machine or whatever, and trying to psychometrically get you to buy that, persuading you. So the same technology can be deployed within, for kind of very propaganda-related or fake news-related purposes. So the way that we are approaching this is that when we think about our quality or credibility score, we actually want to make that totally distributed within the ad networks. So that ad networks, Facebook, search engines, so that when an ad is placed on a piece of content, they actually take into account the quality of the content, rather than just trying to focus on selling to the specific individual, taking some consideration for the quality of the content. So for us, we think that there's no embedded notion of quality within the ad market, and it's really, really important to get to.
And humans aren't going anywhere anytime soon in this process. It's very complex. Actually, a good example, like we said GDP is rising earlier, something that could be checked. What about the phrase, the NHS is in crisis? Crisis means a lot of different things to different people. There are lots of different measures in funding for the NHS. Some of that data isn't actually publicly available, so we spend a lot of our time calling people and asking them where they get their information from, how they did their calculations. Unless you're going to start doing several thousand robocalls, which nobody will respond to, I don't think that humans are going to get out of the loop anytime soon, and the fact-checking bottleneck will probably always remain a bottleneck. And that's good because it means we ensure quality, but that doesn't mean that we can't improve it. We can get more things being checked. We can definitely speed up that process. We can give people tools that actually help them push back in real time. And those are the areas where I see the most value in technology and AI specifically in this space. It's about giving journalists and fact checkers the tools to do more quickly. And then there's the whole publisher side, but that's a whole other talk.
Yeah, I think one thing really interesting from an AI perspective just is this notion of explainability, right? And I think this is one of these problems which is the perfect example of where explainability is really, really important. So in the same way that a fact checker like Full Fact is giving you an explanation of why something is incorrect or not, and providing you that kind of logic, to me it's really interesting how AI could evolve at some point to start to give explanations for things. Really, really difficult task, but again, really, really interesting. And it relates to all sorts of other domains in AI as well.
Can I tell you the story that I forgot?
Yes.
Okay, really quickly. So if you ask 100 people, how many of them are immigrants? Out of 100 people, how many are immigrants? A Leave voter will tell you that 20 in 100 are immigrants. A Remain voter will tell you 10 in 100 are immigrants. The real number is 5. So people have these perceptions about the world, and maybe it then feeds into what they choose to do and how they choose to perceive the world. And it's really, this is one of the harms that actually is the most long-term harm potentially, which leads to distrust in the media and people shutting off entirely. And when people shut off, we actually get a civic vacuum that certain people are happier to fill than others. And it's all, like I said earlier, it's everything from people are wrong on the internet to radicalization and mass distrust. And we have to be really careful about the solutions that we put in place here and really understand that there are no unintended consequences.
Well, thank you very much. That's a very poignant note to end on. We are running over time, but if you would like to ask Mevan and Dhruv any questions, we're going to be moving to the speaker room, I think, for Q&As, if anyone does want to come up and talk to us. But thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you around the conference.